Hey everyone, this is the Coffee with a Geek program. It is April 2017. My coffee cup today is from the Jamestown Ice Arena. There was a really great hockey tournament a long time ago that had some of the international junior teams I went to go see. It's hockey playoff season, so I'm going to throw that one out there and throw that a bone out to Jamestown Ice Arena. It's a great place to play hockey. So with me today is Katie Garner, and Katie is most of my guests. I find you on Twitter, and I found really some great posts and great insights on Twitter. I'm just going to bring up your website quickly. And I was just so impressed with all of your work. And if we can you see here's your main website, which is just katiegarner.com, easy to find you. You can see a lot of your great work. And one of the springboards off of that is the Secret Stories website. And that's really where a lot of your work has come into play. There's a book, The Secret Stories, and it's cracking the reading code with the brain and mind. So I'm going to just stop sharing that. Again, please feel free to go to those websites to find out more information. But let's talk about your educational journey, Katie. So if you can kind of walk me through your background, where you've come from, where reading came into play, and then really maybe dig into some of your work and especially the book and the website, the Secret Stories.
Okay, well, thank you. No, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, my background was a little unusual, and I think it has still helped to this point in looking at things from again, like what I like to call a backdoor perspective. Because I had studied at Juilliard, I studied voice and language, and so we had to study all of the languages and sound as if we were proficient in them, even though we weren't necessarily in only 4 years. But we used something called the IPA, which was the International Phonetic Alphabet, and it allowed us to use basically one set of code to crack or to apply universally to all of these other languages, specifically the Romance languages. And just kind of having used that as a constant tool throughout, my time at Juilliard, I had always had an interest in teaching, and specifically at the earliest grade level. So I was torn even at Juilliard. We were able to take some courses at Columbia in teaching. And when I decided that I didn't think I wanted to perform and the travel was the biggest obstacle to that, I actually had been taking courses in education over the summer every year when I would leave New York from school. And when I graduated from Juilliard, I actually had also had a dual bachelor's in education from having taken courses over the summer and then taken some courses in New York. So I then started actually teaching in the classroom. I went into music because I wasn't certified yet to teach regular ed, because the way that the bachelor's worked, it kind of crossed over from the music classes in addition to those education classes and tests. And I initially just enjoyed using music as a tool to boost skills. The kids who would come alive in the classrooms academically were not necessarily the ones that I would see as really shining stars in my classroom. Likewise in PE. So to be able to foster not just excitement, but a comfort outside of the regular classroom and see them start to really progress with skill work, using music as a vehicle to do it was fascinating to me. So during that time, I pursued a master's. I was much more interested in reading and literacy than anything else. I think probably because of the background with language at Juilliard. And I'm actually going to take this little earphone out because I'm hearing myself as an echo. Anyway, as I was getting my master's, I was able to transition into a regular classroom, started in kindergarten, and was completely overwhelmed with how it was that we were supposed to be reading and writing throughout the day when the kids had absolutely no ability to read or write anything. I assumed I was doing something wrong, or that there was something in the curriculum that I was missing that should turn individual letter sounds into actual ability to read. I would have kids, because I would always use music as a vehicle. I would have kids get, let's say, all their letters and sounds in 2 weeks to 2 months, but they still couldn't read any words, because you can't just go ick, and figure out the word fantastic, or yeah, and know that word's boy. With the phonics patterns or even just the basic blending, letters almost never did what they should. So my kids couldn't read, and I was really frustrated. I then moved on to first grade, and got even more frustrated because then we actually had curriculum that told us they were supposed to read a particular book in our language arts series, or they were supposed to write, at free writing time. And again, I could not figure out how to transition these bits and pieces of skills that our curriculum in first grade sanctioned out and assigned us to impart, and how that little piece of the pie was supposed to lead to their ability to engage with text, so they could write the story they really wanted to tell, about the alien bug that they, created in their head, or how they could pick up a book about something they really had an interest in or a passion for and make it through the first 4 or 5 words, especially if it went beyond sight words. It just was very frustrating. So I, from a common sense and just, at this point I had my master's, I still hadn't really felt like I'd learned much more than I did in my undergrad, in terms of how to get Johnny to read, not just how to think about how to get Johnny to read, not the philosophies only about what we think about how we should get Johnny to read, but the hands-on tools for getting Johnny to read. What I did was I went to the second grade classroom and I went to the third grade classrooms, and I tried to pull all of the parts of their curriculum that would encompass these other skills that I felt that kids still needed to have in order to be able to read the books they were interested in. And then you're just looking at a developmental issue of inappropriateness. I mean, there's so much they need to have as a reader or as a writer, but yet there's so many skills that are involved with that. And then you can kind of see why they broke it out over 3 years and divvied it out. So I kind of felt like I was back to square one. There was a big to-do going on with the phonics and the whole language at that time. And you were kind of having to sit on one side of the fence or the other. There was no balanced literacy yet. And there were a lot of hard feelings from one professor even to the next as to which approach to take. So I had kind of been brought up under the whole language approach. I started to dive into the phonics end of things, became equally frustrated because, again, the developmental readiness of learners at the age where phonics is necessary doesn't match with the content. Phonics are abstract skills and symbols, and these are concrete learners that want to eat it or lick it or play with it. So it just, again, I felt like I was just hitting every possible door or wall that I could hit with regard to getting what I felt they needed in their hands to read and write across the day, and what that content entailed that was so far beyond what was developmentally appropriate to give them. So all of this to say, I did start to get interested. This was right about the time that balanced literacy came into play. Patterns and context, that term patterns is it's a big push with brain-based teaching. Everything is pattern-based. The brain thinks in patterns, but it's also thinking on a thrust of need to know. The reason we pattern out information is it's a way to figure out things. And the things we want to figure out are the things we need to know. And usually that's based on the context of what we're doing in the moment, the book we want to read, the story we want to tell. So patterns and context was just in line completely with what I felt was appropriate for the kids that I was working with. And then looking at how the brain learned, and specifically that word patterns kept coming up. Seeing that really brain-based teaching is nothing but patterns and context. It's the same idea, which is that the brain is a pattern-making machine, but that the brain learns best on its own agenda, and that learning is prioritized, and it's a need-to-know, learner-driven momentum. When we learn, regardless of who we are or how old we are or what we're trying to figure out, we're learning something that is of interest to us or that we need to know, and that's when we have the most priority placed on that learning. So that is a crucial component of what we're doing. And to get kids excited about a K that says K, where there's no meaning attached, there's really no need to know what a K says unless you're looking at the much bigger picture down the road of being able to read or write, which is not what kindergartners necessarily are going to attain very quickly. So it became a challenge to me to figure out how to pair what brain science tells us and what literacy research tells us, which is this patterns and context concept, and how to pair that with what would be something that early learners would need to know. What would excite them or drive them to really want to uncover these skills that are crucial for them to have in order for them to plow through text. And yet, how do we light a fire or give them that need to know? And there's really only one way that you can do that, and that's through meaning. You have to have meaning. You can't pattern out information that has no logic. Logic requires understanding. Understanding requires meaning. So then it just was simply an issue of how do you attach meaning where there is none. And that's what the secret stories are. And that's what I first began doing. It was not in my first year of teaching. My poor first year of students probably learned absolutely nothing. But each subsequent year, I felt like I got a little bit better, and I tried to put a little bit more meaning and a little bit more meaning into the skills they needed. And I looked at each skill or phonics piece as a tool. And I don't really like to use the word phonics per se, because I see secret stories as nothing to do with phonics in all actuality, because it's based in it's a completely different setup of what's done when and how things are embedded into themselves in terms of the skills. It's really more putting meaning where there otherwise would be none, so that we can account for or explain what letters are doing when they're not doing what they should, and in a way that kids, early grade kids, 4-year-olds, can make sense of. And that's where the brain science really came in, because the brain science is just absolutely fascinating when you look at it from the perspective of the areas that are developed first and what learners come to us with. That social, emotive, affective learning domain. That's where everything spins around, and that's really what I started to play with, to just kind of cheat some of the ways that we run into obstacles when we're teaching these skills, and get around things that are weak and tap into areas that are strong. Much more than a mouthful, but that at least gives you an idea of where my head was.
It does, and I tried something new as I was approaching today.
Program.
And I was going to do a sketch note. Fanny Passport actually had talked to me about sketch notes. And as I was watching one of your videos, I came across, you mentioned backdoor, I think, learning, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Can you tell me, maybe, and when I watch one of your videos, and you have just a whole plethora of YouTube videos, which is, I think, really helpful. It really talks about your work and outlines it. And I know you brought up a graphic for kind of backdoor learning, but can you talk a little bit about that, how that backdoor learning, I think you've already hit kind of on the concept.
I did. Yeah, actually, but what you're saying is, that's kind of right where I had even left off, is that affective learning domain. The brain develops back to front, and the higher level processing, the cognitive processing that learners need to have in order to, see a letter and know a sound, or see a phonics pattern and know a sound, or even just abstractly connect information to something where there's not a foundation of meaning yet laid. Those are the higher level areas of the brain that aren't necessarily intact for early learners, or that sometimes upper grade learners may have some obstacles in their path to get to that higher level thinking domain. Whereas the back door is, I call it the back door, but it's the affective, and there's obviously, as the brain develops back to front, there's many areas in the back part of the brain, but the part that I'm most focused on is this affective learning network. It's the area of the brain that even in pre-kindergarten level, kids come in with already intact. It's the part of the brain that responds to social feedback. If you're feeling embarrassed because you had to square dance with a little boy you have a crush on, it's the part of the brain that makes your cheeks turn red when your friends tease you about it. It's the part of the brain that lets you know how it feels when no one will play with you. It's also the part of the brain that drives learner decision making as early as they start coming to school. The reason they all want to run to the door when it's time to line up, even if they haven't ever been in a line before and it's pre-K and they don't even know what a line is or where it's going, they want to do that because there's a social awareness that everybody else wants to be there at the front, and so do I. No one else wants to be at the back, so neither do I. This social, emotive, or affective learning domain really drives their decision making throughout the day and their behaviors. So by being aware of that is a highly functioning area for thinking, not just among early learners, but among struggling upper grade learners, then being able to take advantage of what we know is the plasticity of the brain, which means that, different areas of the brain are responsible for different tasks. But depending on how that content is coded or how it's wrapped up or disguised, we can trick certain areas of the brain into taking information in and storing it and retrieving it that typically would not be identified to do that. And the social emotive network, it has no business in letters and sounds and patterns and symbols. But if we cloak let's say, a phonics skill in a social emotive disguise, like, for example, if I told you that the grown-up secret about AU and AW that you maybe didn't know is that they have a huge crush on each other. I mean, they've been in love for years, and they just get so embarrassed, especially if they have to stand like right up against each other in a word side by side, like the word August or awesome or awful. Anytime they have to stand right up against each other, they get so embarrassed that they always put their heads down and say, ah, ah. And of course, that's the sound that they make. So being able to cloak something that has no inherent meaning in a disguise that immediately allows it to make sense, gives learners a stake that they can hold and store and retrieve and get back to with ease when they're trying to relate this to text. And just looking for these opportunities in what we teach that are abstract or require groundwork to be laid that maybe for many of our students, they just don't have it. Finding those back doors, those little pathways that we can take to get around areas of weakness and tap into these stronger areas to not just retrieve, but to use these skills. And then let those higher level processing areas kind of come on board as a result of having something to process. You know, that's kind of the trick. I kind of call it moving the furniture in the back door, so that when the front door is actually built and you're ready for the open house, it's already all set up and ready to go. Often as teachers, I think we're a slave to readiness, and we feel like we can't teach something until the learner is ready or until he knows this, that, and the other. And, you know, we can sit around and wait forever and a day, and sometimes it's past the time they're even in our classroom. And a lot of learners are getting a whole lot of stuff, you know, much too late. And it's not enough time for them to get this deep in the gut ownership. And specifically with literacy, you know, they have to really own those skills in order to not have them on the periphery when they're trying to read for meaning or write for a purpose. So they need that incubation time to really get them deep in the gut.
So, you know, a lot of my interviews have to do with ed tech. Can you talk a little bit about the connection with ed tech? I know a lot of what you do is kind of early literacy, but is there some ed tech correlations? You know, talk about maybe the good, the bad, the future as far as, you know, ed tech and reading.
Yeah, and I mean, and I have really tried to make it a priority for me to learn, because I'm asked a lot about different types of programs, especially when I'll go into districts and work with them, and you try to seam together what they're doing with, you know, often we have, you know, I've often thought, you know, we have quality control at district levels. We don't always have quantity control. So many times teachers are in a position where they're having to do, you know, 4 different things, and it seems like 3 of which contradict themselves. And sometimes, and I think you especially can see this with technology, it holds the key to almost everything that we're going to be looking at doing in the future. I mean, the technological advances are just beyond the scope that we can even imagine. But in classrooms, all too often you do see technology in place for technology's sake. You know, you'll see students on the computer without a necessary intention. You know, if you ask the teacher what specifically, what are you trying to achieve, having him do this task on this computer at this time, it's sometimes hard, I think, for them to answer. And a lot of times it comes down to, well, we're supposed to log this much time with these students on the computer. So my focus is always, you know, as teachers, we want to employ the best practices, and we want to use the best methods with our kids. And we want to make the technology mold to those methods, what we know works, and not mold the methods to the available technology. And I think sometimes that the methods take the back seat, and you know, we try to fit around what we know are best practices to what the technology thrust is. And I am much more interested in, and have actually I've spoken with some people who kind of do what I do in terms of they speak, but they'll also work with or consult with textbook companies and some of the technology pieces that are coming out. And they'll actually have little, like almost an intermediary, not the programmer, but the person who speaks teacher talk. So that when the teacher can say, look, here's what I do that works, and here's what I want to do specifically with these kids for this purpose. I want to take out the wiggle room so we can really target what we need to do, and I want to make it something easy for teachers to pinpoint so that it kind of does a lot of the figuring out on their part. But the way they describe it, they're describing what really best practices are, what they do that really works in their classroom one-on-one. And they're giving that information to someone who gets it. And then that person also, though, has the background in technology to then talk to those programmers who often are brilliant, but, you know, they're not always teachers. They don't necessarily know what it's like to look at Johnny in the face and try to, you know, go about explaining something to him every which way to Sunday until it clicks, and then seeing what form of manipulation with that skill is really making sense to him. So I think these intermediaries that are, you know, half teacher, half programmer, they speak the speak on both ends, and I think they've been the most successful at really bringing to fruition what the teacher in her head knows works, but that sometimes technology can take for a turn if that isn't maintained and held true through the process. So that's been exciting to me. And I am working with a few different places. We're looking at doing some things that would definitely require that intermediary. Because I think anything I say directly to a programmer, he would not be able to translate at all. But I think that's the biggest issue that I see, is just, you know, holding true to what those best practices and those best methods are, and not ever letting technology be the more important piece of that equation, using it to contour and to support what we know works. And it's certainly doable, and in ways we probably haven't even thought of. But I think it definitely takes almost a specially trained person that I would love to see universities start, you know, putting out there, you know, having that ability to kind of think on both ends, to really translate for us as educators into the technological world, you know, what we know and how to kind of carry that through to a whole nother level without losing the, you know, the intention behind it.
Wow, lots to think about in that. And let's think about the future, if we could. And I'm going to combine kind of two of my questions. So the first question is, where do you see education, you know, 1, 5, 10 years? So how do you see the progression going? And if you could design your own school based on, you know, your experiences and your knowledge, especially with literacy, how would you design it? So we'll pull those two questions together.
Okay. Well, first I'm going to hit the second part at the beginning, only just to toss out and say that I have a lot of friends, close friends, who are administrators, who are principals, and they have told me that I would, I mean, and I know this is figurative, but I would make the absolute world's worst head of a school. So just throwing that out there, because I am all about, you know, in the moment. I would plop down in a heartbeat, forget every other thing that's on that agenda, and we would always go with the flow of what's happening. So, but I can certainly, in my perfect head of heads, come up with where I would, you know, love to see things be, starting though with where I think things are headed. And that is, you know, with the brain science. We really haven't even made a dent yet in shifting our momentum in how we do what we do, and when we do it, in regard to what the brain science shows, especially in the area of literacy. In the area of literacy, it's literally almost untouched. I mean, almost everything we do, and I don't mean literacy in terms of, you know, the base piece of our, you know, curriculum or the books that we read. I mean literacy in terms of how the brain learns, patterns and context, and yet, you know, we're still teaching skills that are random and isolated, spreading them across 3 different years before they can ever be compiled into something that actually lets kids do what reading and writing is all about, which is read for meaning, write for a purpose. You know, it's a code. A code's only as useful as all of it together. You know, you can't pick and choose what parts of the code learners need and when, because it's about what the story is that learner wants to write, and what sounds are in the words they want to use, or what patterns will be in the words in the books that they want to read. So for us to pick and choose what sounds and symbols and phonics pieces they get in first grade and second grade and kinder, it's completely out of scope with the way that the brain learns. As is, I see a lot of the way that we approach literacy specifically. And when we look at not even the brain science, but the early literacy research, you know, Richard Allington's one of the foremost leaders on this. And I had the privilege of doing a keynote series. It was a 2-year keynote series ongoing, the Vulnerable Learners Summits. And it specifically looks at learners before they are 3rd grade. Where they've already been identified as in need or failing. It's looking at those learners before that train wreck happens and seeing what we know, what the research shows us about where they're headed and why they end up there and why this consistently keeps happening. And we then have these kids coming out as not being literate. Learning from him and seeing the importance of pre-K, K first. The need for early, expert, and intensive expertise in those teachers so that they have the ability, you know, they can do across 8 hours something that we can spend forever trying to make up the lost time for. So seeing a school system where the priority is not on the testing grades, but on those earliest grades where the most impact can be made for purposes of testing later, but for actual, for the purpose of the actual learner's needs, you know, to really get them before they fall. And I don't see that often, you know, I see the opposite. I see a lot of administrators putting the teachers that they're most concerned about either ready to retire and maybe not really interested in being there, or just starting out like myself that first year when you really don't know what you're doing. You know, I see often those early grades become a dumping ground for the teachers where you're not quite sure what to do with them. And then you put teachers at those upper grades to try and boost that test score. And everything we know shows that it should be the other way around. The most critical time frame are those early grades. So I see things moving in that direction where funding, I've already seen it with professional development. I am so overwhelmed with professional development. I almost don't have enough time for conferences because of the PD. And I'm thrilled about that because that PD is the number one thing that we can do for those early grade teachers so that they have that expertise and literacy. They don't necessarily have it intact, you know, by default. Often we're, you know, it's not from lack of due diligence. They're running around with the ball. It's just often we see teachers running around in a lot of different directions. And the brain science is really that compass that can bring us right back to knowing where we need to head and letting the teachers use their own expertise to get there. But having the pieces necessary dropped into that expertise that will really kind of guide them so they know why they're doing what they're doing and they can contour it around that premise. And again, both ends, from Dr. Allington, Dr. Tim Shanahan, Debbie Diller. I mean, there's just so much combining of where the science tells us what the science tells us we can do in conjunction with what the research shows we need to do. And letting the science open the door that in the past was really not accessible to us. So the hurdles that we faced, we just had to live with as often the nature of the beast. And I think that's what prompted this whole language phonics pendulum to keep swinging wildly, was we had no third option. But now we do. And we learn more about it all the time, every day. So much so that you were mentioning those blogs and the vlogs. I mean, I can barely keep straight half of the things that I'm saying because no sooner do you get it out of your mouth then something else comes to fruition that allows you to contour it and fine tune it even more. But unlike the philosophies, it doesn't throw you totally out of where you were to begin with. It just lets you get better, stronger, faster with the direction you're already headed. And that's where I love to play with the research, to just cheat to get around the areas that are constantly in our path and seek out those solutions that prior to, you know, this time period, we really didn't have at our disposal, and just keep learning and learning and learning, and using the educational research base as a track for best practice and intentional kind of direction. You know, letting those that know the most about education separate and aside from the brain science, but they've already determined and really figured out, much by trial and error, what works, and then the research that supports what works, and seeing how that brain science can really boost that and make it doable for a teacher. So in my perfect school, it would be, or in my perfect system, aside from knowing that 10 years from now, brain science will be a leading focus in all universities, because that's absolutely the trend without question. Aside from that end would be teachers really knowing why they're doing what they're doing, knowing how they're going to get there, and being allowed to deviate off the course as needed so that they can take those kids where those kids need to go, and let the learners drive that instruction along the way. And just kind of keeping this right playground for critical thinking in which all of this can happen, and not having things kind of pre-laid out like a Broadway show where you have Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, and we're not deviating from this course. You know, and Dick calls that a program. I call it a Broadway show. But he's right. You know, a program is a program. It's set in stone. There's no way to use that effectively with every learner unless you can back up, look at it as a resource, and be comfortable pulling it apart, playing with it, and flipping things around as you need to. And hopefully having districts and states, that will allow, departments of ed, that will allow teachers the latitude to be able to do that. But for that to happen, teachers have to know why they're doing it. And if someone walks in their classroom, they need to be able to answer that question. This is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it. And right now, often the first part's answered. The second part sometimes, the why is because this is what we're supposed to be doing on Thursday at 11. And again, that's not going to get us where the research shows we can be.
I think a lot of teachers would have given you a standing ovation for that. I think you're right on with that, so I would agree wholeheartedly. With that, let me ask you about your future projects. Do you have anything up and coming? Maybe you want to tease us with?
It's just spinning and spinning. What I'm most excited about is probably not the biggest thing, but it's what I'm most excited about is I'm going to be doing an audio recording of the secret story. So it's going to be like a book on tape, but tape is not relevant any longer. Just an audio book, so that I'm going to enjoy it because I am a terrible writer. And by terrible, I mean I try to write like I talk. And, the excitement that I feel when I really, get off and make points or say something that I know is going to make a huge difference in how teachers might look at something, it's hard to capture in words. So I cannot wait. And when I say in words, I mean in written words. So to be able to speak and kind of veer off, as I said, I almost never say the same thing twice, even if it's in a book, I know I'm going to go off. But I can't wait to have that opportunity. So that's something that I'm excited to do. And to get out. I think it'll make it easier for teachers as well. Over the summer, if you're laying out at the beach, you don't have to bring your book from your PD, your learning community group. You can just plop on your earbuds. So that's certainly something that I'm definitely excited about. But I have a lot of PDs, as I said, a big message last year, specifically at these literacy summits with Dick Allington, Ann Cunningham, one of the authors of the NELP report, which is the National Early Literacy Report, everything focusing on the importance of professional development at those earliest grades. Well, I think I beat that drum so loud that I've now get to reap the fruits of that labor, because the PDs are extraordinary this year, which I'm excited about, because the goal that I have is to ultimately get teachers trained to support their own PD, so that I may not have to go out, 2 or 3 or 4 times, not just to do a PD with the teachers, but sometimes I'll do classroom modeling. It's always much more ideal if you can train teachers to come to you and have some sort of a system where then their district can have an in-house expert to really enact the same strategies, but be their own support system. So that I'm excited about. I'm also working much more closely this year with, and I think this is much to do with, again, the thrust of last year, with Title I. I'm going to be at the ILA conference this year, the International Literacy Conference in the summer. And I'm at almost all of the state reading conferences as well. And I do keynotes or featured sessions, but this year I'm going to do a lot with the state Title I conferences. And I think, again, that's going to align much more closely with the initiative on early literacy specifically. Not just plugging holes. The upper grades are where my passion is, because I feel like the upper grade learners are so painfully aware of what they know they don't know, that there's nothing more gratifying than to plug a hole that they've had for years, and to use the brain science to do that, to get around blocks that in their path are humongous. That's always my personal kind of love. But I understand from a practical perspective that everything needs to start at the bottom up. So early literacy is the key. And I think with the Title I funding, specifically, looking at Head Start, a lot of those programs, they have the power and the audience to pull things together and really unify what our efforts are at those early grade levels. Not let pre-K just kind of sit out there as the redheaded stepchild, like it seems like it's been for many years, disconnected from, what we then kind of swoop them up into as soon as they start with kinder. So my focus this coming year is going to be just kind of transitioning from what I've done last year and just doing it about 10 times more in about 100 more places. I'll just be very busy running around. But certainly I'll be blogging and vlogging, and I'm relying a lot more on teachers to do a lot of that with me as well, so that they can take up and show what they're doing in their classrooms instead of me just being a talking head. Again, as I am working so much more closely with so many more districts across the country.
Yeah, I think outsourcing is really an important use of technology and a really valuable one for teachers because we're such collaborators and sharers.
Absolutely. And I didn't really even touch on those things, the things that I just feel like are our constant go-to. You know, without technology, I don't think that, I mean, I know that my message wouldn't even be probably beyond the, you know, few hundred that you talk to when you fly out to wherever you are. The last few years with really trying to be more of a presence online, it has opened up so many more doors to get to those teachers and administrators even who don't go to conferences or who don't have funding, you know, to attend. And being able to still go back and forth and communicate with them. I'd say that's probably about 50% of the connections that I work with are not those that can come to conferences or states that don't even have literacy conferences. So, I mean, that's just a given. That's part of what's so exciting about where it's taking us. I hope to some point be a hologram and just be able to beam myself to some of these places and still be able to flap my arms and be just as excited as I would be if I were there, but not necessarily have to take the 3 flights to get there.
Right. Well, that's personalized learning, right?
That's right.
All right. Well, I've taken quite a bit of your time in it, but I do want to just throw a couple speed geek questions at you. We won't do all 3. We'll just take 2. How's that? Just quick, short answer, hopefully some fun questions. So I'm going to bring up the screen here, the spinning wheel.
Oh boy.
Can you see the wheel?
I do not see a wheel. Oh, I see the wheel.
Okay. So here goes. We'll start off with your first question. Oh, the toughest one of all. Your favorite educational blog. Do you have a blog that you like to follow?
I do. I actually like Shanahan on literacy. Tim Shanahan. I like that he is not afraid. Like Dick Allington, he's not afraid to pick a fight. He's not afraid to take a stance. He's not afraid for you to argue with him. He's not only a great guy, but I always find myself going, every time I read even if his post isn't relevant necessarily to what I might be focusing on. I think he just did a secondary education post maybe a week or so ago, but there's never time I read what he writes and am not just stretched in some new way or have some need to go off and then Google, whatever it was that was the source that he mentioned to just figure out more and kind of dig a little deeper into it.
Okay, here comes your second one. That's a good recommendation. I hadn't heard of that one. So,
yeah, he's wonderful.
All right, your favorite social network. I know you're connected.
Should I say my most obsessive social network or my favorite social network? My most obsessive is Pinterest. I cannot get off of it. I just get sucked into it and I could just spend days there. So that is my most obsessive one, I think. But Twitter's my favorite. It's hard to get too obsessive. Well, you can get obsessive with Twitter, but you can only say so much, So, you're not on Twitter too long because you got to go somewhere from it since you're only going to get just so many characters before you're going to have to go somewhere else to dig deeper for it. So that's my favorite, I think. But I definitely spend the most time on Pinterest.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Katie, for your time.
Can I tell you one more thing I just forgot? There is a white paper that I'm excited about too. I forgot about it because I'm not the one that's doing it. But there's a professor, she actually did, her name's Jill Buchan, and she's been working with a couple other professors. Actually, there are a couple different studies. One is looking at empirical data using the strategies, specifically the secret stories in different states. Jill is working on a white paper that is the basis for this research, much of what I've talked about today with, with Dr. Allington's work and the NELP report, and then adding, James Zoll and some pieces where you're really bridging that brain research with that educational base. And Jill Buchanan, she's a professor in, I think, Iowa. She did a white paper for the two sisters. I think that came out last year. And the one that she's working on that is researching the strategies on which I speak, I think that's due out sometime late spring, early summer. So I haven't seen it yet, but I can't wait to. And that's another thing I'm incredibly excited about because I'm such a fan of so many people's work that will be a part of this space. That to see it kind of come together specifically for the purpose of the strategies that I speak on is just, I'm over the moon. So I'm looking forward to seeing her work.
Great. Well, Katie, again, thank you so much for your time. And I'll keep following you on Twitter and your website. So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
It's an honor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.